When attraction is high, it obliterates everything. All objections, all obstacles, they melt away. Red flags go from this to this. And that's what Jane Eyre and Twilight feature front and center. It's what makes these novels so popular, because they convey to the reader this overwhelming emotion, this irresistible, magnetic, black hole style pull. But how? In this video, we're going to look at 3 specific ways in which these novels manipulate our emotions, so we can use these same techniques in the way that we write relationships. Heyo, Stunt Reader here. The aim of this channel is to help you level up your craft as a novelist by learning to actively read novels, in your genre and out, both classic and contemporary, to figure out what it is that makes these works so emotionally compelling to so many people. If this is of interest to you, subscribe, ding the notification bell so you'll be sure to know when I upload my next video. Active reading is one of the easiest and most reliable ways to take your writing skills to the next level. So let's get reading. Attraction. It's what blinds us to the flaws in the object of our affection. This is our psychology. This is our biology. It's the imperative of the species to reproduce. It's not to find your soulmate. It's not to find somebody compatible that you can spend the rest of your life with. If that was the imperative, I think our species would have died out a long time ago. So this is a universal aspect of the human condition. Plenty of stories feature this dynamic. If you've ever written a love story or woven in a romantic subplot, you'll have tried to convey some of this sense to your reader. We're going to look at Jane Eyre and Twilight because these are 2 books that I've happened to have read recently and came away with lessons that I feel we can all apply to our own writing. Keep in mind, these books are immensely popular. To me, that indicates that they've struck an emotional chord with readers. When an author strikes that emotional chord and hits it again and again repeatedly, that's what creates that emotional resonance that we're looking to convey in our own writing. Point number 1. Establish an ordinary world and a reliable, sensible protagonist. My edition of Jane Eyre has 524 pages. We don't even meet Rochester until page 134. That's a quarter of the way in. The first 4 chapters are Jane as a 10-year-old orphan living with her insufferable relatives who treat her horribly. The next 6 chapters are Jane taking her through her adolescence from 11 to about 18 at the Lowood School, which is equally hostile, chilly, loveless. So we've seen her, we've been alongside her for those first 120 odd pages in 2 hostile environments. And we've suffered with her. We've seen how she copes, how she's resilient, and how she maintains her dignity despite these hardships. So at the end of this very long wind-up, we've really come to relate to her and to empathize with her. And we're really rooting for her by the end of that preamble, you could call it. And it's true that novels really just aren't written this way anymore. You rarely take the first quarter of the novel to go and trace your character's childhood and adolescence and then get to the meat. All of the writing guides now will tell you, start in medias res, as close to the end as possible. Let the reader, you can work in bits and hints of backstory as you go. Let the reader piece it together for him or herself, that's more rewarding. Leave it to the reader's imagination. This is all very sound, solid advice. I'm not suggesting that you write a 125-page preamble to your novel, but notice the benefits that Charlotte Bronte gets out of that, of spending that kind of time in that ordinary world before moving to the extraordinary world, the special world of Thornfield, which is Rochester's estate. she firmly establishes a protagonist that we've really come to relate to and know as self-reliant, resilient, not easily cowed, not easily overwhelmed, which sets us up for that very dramatic shift later in after that first quarter when we do meet Rochester, and she starts to become less of those things. Then we recognize this is a big shift for her when attraction does enter her life, pre-attraction and post-attraction. So that's the advantage that Charlotte Bronte gets by spending that much time in the ordinary world. Let's look at the way that Twilight deals with that ordinary world, and it's almost the opposite end of the spectrum, where we really don't spend any time in the ordinary world. The ordinary world would be Arizona, where she lived with her mother. Twilight starts right off with her on the way to the special world, which is the rainy, dreary Pacific Northwest, where she's going to live with her kind but often absent father. Imagine if in Twilight we had spent 124 pages with Bella in sunny Arizona, with her mother, with her school friends, maybe with a love interest, maybe with a teacher that she really admired, getting a good sense for who she is, and then moving to the Pacific Northwest. Now, I'm not saying that would make for a better book. I'm just saying, imagine how different that book would be. And again, this is a continuum, and I think you have kind of Twilight here at the very briefest end of establishing that ordinary world, the very sketchiest end, and Jane Eyre at the other extreme, where it's almost a novel in itself establishing the ordinary world. Somewhere in the middle, maybe. This is one of the main techniques of active reading. One of the novelist's main questions is asking, what if? What if this? And then what if that? And apply that question to your reading. What if this writer had made this other decision? What if we had spent more time in that ordinary world instead of starting right in the Pacific Northwest? What benefit would that have given the writer? What benefit would that have given the reader? Ask this question of the books as you're reading them. Make notes. Spin out scenarios. I'm aware that Twilight gets a lot of criticism for the implausibility of the relationship between Bella and Edward. And I think some of that may well stem from the fact that with Bella, we don't have as clear a sense of her character. We don't have as clear a sense of this shift happening pre-attraction, post-attraction. With Jane, we know who she is, and then when she meets, and there's a before and an after that are very starkly contrasted, whereas with Bella, because we didn't get that before, that after, it's not nearly as stark. So when Bella falls for Edward, we don't perceive this as such a radical change in her being as we do when Jane falls for Rochester. And boy, do they both fall hard. And for guys who are waving more red flags than a May Day parade in Tiananmen Square, I mean, these guys are toxic. And that brings us to point number 2. Pile on the red flags. Don't tone them down. Don't round them out. I mean, let's look at them. Who's worse, Edward or Rochester? Okay, let's start with Edward. He follows you uninvited to another town. He shows up in your room late at night while you're sleeping and watches you. He will break into your house and retrieve something for you, even though you've asked him not to. He will insist on picking you up. He will threaten you with physical violence. He demonstrates his strength and his speed to her, and he says, "As if you could outrun me," he laughed bitterly. And then, "As if you could fight me off," he said gently. The icing on the cake, of course, is that he is a vampire and could well eat her. That would be bad. But classic stalker / vampire. Okay, let's go to Rochester. So It is revealed right at the altar that actually, no, he can't marry Jane because he is married. So he is a liar. He is an attempted bigamist. Now, having established that he is a liar, very capable of lying, he tells her that he only married his wife for her fortune, as though this is a good thing, and only after his father had left him out of any plans for the family estate, which would also seem to be a pretty big red flag. He confesses that, so she has been aware that he had a mistress in Paris, and that is the daughter of that relationship. Adele is the girl that Jane was hired to be a governess for, to teach and help take care of. So she's aware of that extramarital relationship, but he does reveal that in addition, he hired, and that's the word used, he hired 2 other mistresses in that 10-year period while he was married. Hiring a mistress is the next worst thing to buying a slave. He's also capable of violence. He threatens violence. Jane, will you hear reason? He stooped and approached his lips to my ear. Because if you won't, I'll try violence. Most importantly, he brought his wife back from Jamaica and locked her away for 10 years. He says it was because she was insane, but regardless, first of all, are we supposed to take this liar's word? This liar who is attempting to persuade Jane to stay with him, are we really supposed to take his word for his wife's mental state 10 years ago? He says she was insane, but whether she was or not, she certainly is now after spending 10 years in extrajudicial solitary confinement and not being allowed out at all. It's unreal. So Rochester, a classic sociopath. I know from participating in writing workshops and that sort of thing, you'll hear people say, like,
there should be some positive points to balance out the negative.
I think these 2 stories really kind of show, at the very least, it doesn't hurt to pile on the red flags, and not just to show, but really like convey to the reader, this person isn't quite right, or this person is all wrong, but because of that attraction, they're still drawn to them. I want to add, when I say pile on the red flags, I mean pile on the objective red flags that a reader will pick up on. The person who's under the sway of attraction is not going to pick up on them, and that's where in both Twilight and Jane Eyre, that's where first person comes in really handy. You're in their heads. So while we're seeing some of these things out in the relationship that trigger our sense of red flags, they're blowing past it. And that's the key part, is that the character is not picking up on these red flags. So that might be a little harder to do in third person, where the narrator is there's some distance and maybe commenting, or there are other characters involved who are commenting. But it's important that both of these characters really don't have a mentor or a close friend that they can confide in, who can then give some perspective and say, hey, some of these things seem a little sketchy. So that would be something you could do, but in both these books, that's not there. And so we see the red flags, but they don't. And that's what conveys that sense of attraction, I think, to the reader on a not quite conscious level. On a conscious level, it can be more of an irritation, like, why aren't you seeing these? But I think the reader, the reader can understand on a deeper level, he or she is not picking up on them because of that attraction. Point 3, intermittent rewards. This is what makes gambling so addictive. It's what makes social media so addictive, so hard to quit. It's what makes abusive relationships so hard to quit. You don't, when you pull the lever on the slot machine, you don't always get a reward. When you do get the reward, it's very nice and exciting, but many times when you're pulling that lever, nothing happens. And that is true of both these books. We get this at the outset of Twilight, where Edward, he goes hot and cold because when he's near her, he feels such attraction to her that he really has to keep such a tight wrap on himself that he can't even look at her, can't speak to her. So sometimes he's nice to her, he rescues her early, but other times he ignores her. And she doesn't know what the cause is, and this only increases her attraction. And that is often the way it works in the real world as well. When that reward that you get is up here, but much of the rest of the time you're getting either a neutral, nothing, or even a negative, you still play the game because of that potential for reward. And it works best when it's intermittent, when it's not on a regularly scheduled delivery, when you don't know what the cause of that reward is. And the same thing happens in Jane Eyre. Rochester, sometimes he's really nice to her, and other times he treats her like the hired help and just kind of ignores her or is even rude to her. She is the hired help, and he treats her like it at times. So again, in the very early stages, at least, intermittent rewards are an important thing. And all of these things, I think, are things that, in the words of one of my favorite critics, Mike Stacklasa from Red Letter Media, he likes to review movies, and he makes this joke, but a point, I think it's a very good point. You didn't notice, but your brain did. And it's sort of like this idea that you aren't quite sure why these things resonate with you, but it's sort of in the lizard brain gets it. These are aspects of human behavior that both these novels address and convey to their advantage. A bonus point: add an element of the Gothic, of horror, of fear. This attraction is such an overwhelming emotion, an overwhelming sensation, that it can be destabilizing. It can really give the person a feeling that they've lost control, and that can be quite frightening. And so adding an element of fear to the character, not necessarily coming from that object of attraction, but just in her or his environment, through Gothic details, through subtle touches, subtle destabilizing touches, frightening touches, can really go a long way to conveying that the character's emotional state of this is overwhelming. Twilight, being a vampire novel, you would expect to have a lot of fear and a lot of Gothic touches, and she kind of actually plays down the Gothic because it is going for a more modern feel. Vampire lore is sort of all over the place in this book. And I personally never really get the sense that Edward is actually potentially going to attack Bella. But, and again, it doesn't have to come from the object of her attraction. It has to be in her environment. So when James appears and the story does veer away from your typical love story, which turns on the axis of love and hate, into an action story, which is much more primal, which turns on an axis of life and death, now that fear enters in as James begins to pursue her relentlessly, and Edward and his family try to protect Bella and ultimately her mother as well. So now the fear enters in, and now that destabilization, that having to shift environments, that being on the run, that enters in, and I think kind of stands in for that sense of this has overwhelmed my life. And I think that's part of why, even though it, to my mind, I didn't really understand why this novel worked in the broader culture as well as it did, because it just jumped from one genre completely into another, with villains who come out of nowhere and who, they're not even introduced in the first part of the book. But I think it's because that outside influence, really what it is it's showing the reader and putting the reader in that situation where it has completely taken over Bella's life. It really hits that attraction emotional chord in an odd way that obviously works. Jane definitely has a lot of Gothic. It's one of the reasons why I just love this novel to pieces. It is essentially a Gothic romance / coming of age story. But Thornfield in particular has a lot of Gothic elements. The crazy woman in the attic, which is his wife, who is cackling mysteriously in the middle of the night and setting fires, all fantastic Gothic elements. But let's just take a look at the moment right before Jane meets Rochester. She's gone for a walk to take a letter to the post a couple miles away. She sits on a bench to about halfway just to take a break, look back over Thornfield. From my seat, I could look down on Thornfield. The gray and battlemented hall was the principal object in the vale below me. Its woods and dark rookery rose against the west. I lingered till the sun went down among the trees and sunk crimson and clear behind them. So you've got the dark rookery, that's a place where they keep crows, and the sun setting crimson, setting sort of blood red behind Thornfield. And then, immediately after that, she hears the sound of hoofbeats. And it's sort of getting dark now. It's twilight. As this horse approached, and as I watched for it to appear through the dusk, I remembered certain of Bessie's tales. Bessie was her, when she was a child, her nursemaid. I remembered certain of Bessie's tales wherein figured a north of England spirit called a Gytrash, which, in the form of horse, mule, or large dog, haunted solitary ways, and sometimes came upon belated travelers, as this horse was now coming upon me. So you've got the mysterious Gytrash, which is a pretty good pun, guy, trash, not far off from what Rochester truly is. Gytrash does not show up in the monster manual. It's conveying this sense of unease before she even meets him, that again, you're not necessarily going to remember as you get into meeting him, but already right at the outset is that sense of fear, that sense of just a slight destabilization before we even meet him, that primes us for that further sense that will go on as the story progresses. Establish the ordinary world. That's very basic. That you want to do pretty much in any novel at the outset, is establish an ordinary world and then an extraordinary world. But I think here you can see how important it is. Certainly, you have two extremes. One that spends very little time establishing the ordinary world, and one that spends perhaps in excess, at least to modern sensibilities, an excess of time establishing the ordinary world and the character in that world. Point 2, pile on the red flags. Don't be afraid to make this character seem, the object of the affection, seem overly bad, because that conveys to the reader that sense that this attraction is so strong that even with these telltale signs, the pull is there. Remember intermittent rewards, that there should be some rewards, something that rewards that attraction, but very intermittently, especially at the outset, causing the person who is attracted to want to pursue. And then add an element of the Gothic, of horror, of fear, of uncertainty, destabilization, to further reinforce how this feeling, this pull of attraction, and again, the fear doesn't have to come from the object of affection, but just something in the character's environment that is destabilizing and giving them fear, giving them even some horror. Remember, when we're writing, we're usually being very rational, but what we're writing about is an utterly irrational and potentially transformative experience. So I hope you've gotten some value from these ramblings about attraction and Jane Eyre and Twilight and red flags. I'd love to hear from you if you're presently working on a scene or a sequence that involves the attraction phase of a relationship, or maybe you worked on one in the past that didn't quite work out and you're thinking about taking another look at it, giving it another go. Or if you're working on a subplot that involves attraction. I'd love to hear about these things in the comments. And if you'd like to see more of this kind of content, writing tips from active reading, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and you'll be sure to know when I upload another video. And until then, keep reading, keep writing.